We have lots of time for questions now, which is great because there's lots of good questions. I'm going to start by looking at one where this would be an interesting one. Andrew agrees that the human rights violations must cease and that the arms trade is inherently abhorrent. But that the situation is complicated by the fact that the lawfully elected government of Yemen asked the Saudis for help. If the Saudi-led coalition stopped the violations, would you say it was legitimate for them to be involved? So there's lots in there. Would anyone like to start with that? I think we've got two questions about the lawfully elected government, but also what would happen if they stopped the violations. Thank you, Andrew.
Salman needs to take that this alleged lawful government. I mean, just to clarify, when Osama said when the war actually started, so when the Houthis had surrounded Sana'a in 2014, September 2014, Hadi, the president of Yemen at the time, had run for elections, and he was the only one to have run for elections. And it was when he became president for a very limited time, and they were supposed to have elections again, which obviously never happened. But to the point of when they moved into Sana'a on the 18th of September, when they took over in 4 days, Hadi, the president, had signed an agreement with the Houthis at the time when they took over the capital of Yemen, right? And then he only fled when they surrounded his palace, and he went to Aden in the south. And then from there, he fled again to the capital of Saudi Arabia, Riyadh, right? And so I think we need to question the legitimacy of a government that behaves that way. And along the way, Hadi has resigned numerous times, and Osama can talk more about that. And so I would question the legitimacy of a government that requests the war on its own people as well. I think there is something in there that buys into the Saudi narrative and justification of the war. And that is problematic. And so I think it resonates with a lot of the Americans when they made the excuse of the war in Iraq or Afghanistan. It's just a few months, we're going in, we're going out, we're going to be greeted with flowers, and it will be great, and there'll be minimal damage to the countries, and look where we are now, which is the same thing of where we are now with Yemen. It's 5 years, 6 years in, and it is an absolute disaster. And so there's a way of justifying their behavior of waging war on the people of Yemen in this way. And I mean, I say it like when we're talking about this man-made disaster in Yemen, starvation, or the Yemenis being starved, are not just in the Houthi areas. They're also in the Saudi coalition-controlled areas. What does that tell you? This is not a thing that they are targeting just the Houthi areas, and this is why that area is being starved because of the war. It is so badly managed that they can barely keep it together in Aden itself. For example, when I last was allowed in Aden, I met with the UAE forces. One, they were scared shitless of even getting out of their own bases. Right, they were so afraid of the other militias that actually had more control of the city than they did. Right, and so it's such a fallacy that they actually have any control of the areas that they're in, or that they're bringing back legitimacy to the Republic of Yemen, and especially with the UAE, because now they're clearly backing the STC, the Southern Council, which is definitely not calling for a Yemeni republic, and they're calling for their own independent South. And so all of this belies the realities of why they're at war and why they're continuing to be at war. And I think it goes more into the military-industrial complex that both the UAE and Saudi have become complicit in, but also how they've made it such a business now inside Yemen that all the militias are directly benefiting financially from the continuation of the war. So they've made it even more complicated to have a true peace agreement between all the Yemeni factions on the ground, because they really are I mean, not to take away agency from the Yemeni parties and their role in the war, but actively both the Saudis and the Emiratis are feeding this war. So even if both the Saudis and the Emiratis withdraw, they have their proxies on the ground right now that are being paid. And I'm sorry, Osama, I'm sure you can talk more about a more up-to-date situation in Yemen right now, but like it just upsets me when people buy into this narrative. It's ridiculous.
Yes, regarding the situation of the Yemeni government, it's a very complicated, and there is like a big debate legally about the legitimacy of the government of Yemen, and this is why we see in different international reports or UN reports when they refer to the government as the internationally recognized government. The situation on the ground is very complicated, and we have different authorities. We have the de facto authorities, the Houthis in their areas. We have the internationally recognized government of Yemen. We have the Southern Transitional Council in the south. But we have different authorities, or I can say when I describe their violations, that we have similar violations and multiple powers in many ways, and we can see how similar they are when they commit violations, and when they are very identical and similar in committing these violations, including the arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, and torture, for example. The other point about the war economy that started with the war, I completely agree with Safa that all the armed groups and authorities are benefiting from this war. And I can see that in the streets of Sana'a when I walk, including the fuel crisis, for example, when it's not available for people, but it's available in the black market to get fuel. And I can refer also that the war economy is not what I see in Sana'a, but also the arms sales also is part of this war economy in the bigger picture internationally.
Anyone else want to add anything, David? Or?
Yeah, sorry, my mic. Yeah, just on that question of the legitimate government. I mean, the internationally recognized government. I mean, even if you put that to one side, you can separate questions like in terms of the right conduct in war and whether the war should begin or not. So even if let's say you take it that this is a legitimate government, and even that it's right to intervene on behalf of the legitimate government, nothing in that justifies what has happened next. Nothing in that justifies indiscriminate bombing of civilians, widespread and systematic attacks on civilian targets. None of it justifies hitting schools, hitting hospitals, hitting camps for internally displaced people, hitting clinics, double tap strikes on civilian targets, hitting sources of food, hitting ports, pursuing a policy of deliberate starvation. And it's not as if those modes of war fighting have been peripheral to the Saudi campaign. That has been the Saudi campaign. It's state terrorism. So it's worth remembering that point, because if as an activist or someone who wants to raise this with their MP, you say that you're concerned about Yemen, and then the person says in response, but we're supporting the legitimate government. You can make these arguments about whether or not it should be recognised as a legitimate government. Your alternative, if you don't want to get into that argument, can be to just say, well, even if it is a legitimate government, why does that justify this indiscriminate bombing of civilians? You know, and it doesn't. So, no, I know you didn't, Andrew. I know you didn't. I'm suggesting a line you can take with people.
Thank you very much for that question. We have a couple on some particular human rights cases in Saudi Arabia. one in terms of whether people are still trying to save the former King Abdullah's daughters who've been in prison and not heard of, and comparisons with the situation in UAE. And also in terms of the president of Yemen imprisoned in Saudi Arabia, and where Yemen does not currently have a president in their own country. Could we take those together?
I can take the one about the Saudi princesses, and I'm sure Osama can speak about Hadi. The thing is that the case of the late King Abdullah's daughters is they are no longer the only royals that are now disappeared or in prison. And so we just documented a whole slew of them. And most recently, Princess Basma, who actually used to live here in London, Prince Salman bin Abdulaziz, who has also been kidnapped from his palace. And so the level of repression right now that we used to be familiar with when it came to people who were considered political opponents or openly critical of the government. What's happening now under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is that he's arresting even the other royals that he thinks might be opposition to him or a threat to his power. So what he did is he consolidated a lot of the power that used to be more dispersed among the royal family. So can you imagine? It was already a really tight circle of royals who actually controlled most of the assets of the state and the decision making is now even smaller. And I'm sure everybody remembers what happened in the Ritz when he rounded up a lot of princes and also some of the biggest businessmen in Saudi Arabia. And basically it was a shakedown of these who we thought were untouchable before. And a lot of them were disappeared, tortured, put in prison, put in undisclosed locations. When we testified in front of the Tom Lantos Commission in front of Congress last week, we spoke about secret prisons that are actually inside the palace of the Crown Prince in Riyadh, where he keeps royals and other high profile, too dangerous to put in an official prison, and just simply disappear them, torture them, and they don't have to be answerable to even the minimal of what is answerable within the Saudi judicial system. And so now it's rampant. I mean, we only know about these cases, and I would consider that they are the tip of the iceberg of what is actually happening in Saudi Arabia, because the fear now is unprecedented. And so it's not just people like us, regular Saudis who are disappearing. It's also the most powerful in the country that we never thought would be arrested, like Prince Walid bin Talal, who owned huge shares in Apple and Fox, and people that you thought would be immune. Mohammed bin Nayef, who used to be the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who was removed and now disappeared. And so the list is very long. So it's not just the daughters of the late King Abdullah. And so it's not about campaigning for them, but it's campaigning for human rights in general in Saudi. And they're just symbolic of how rampant the repression is right
now. Regarding the Yemeni President Hadi, it's not a matter of detention, but it confirms the fact that what's going on in Yemen is a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So in the case of the government, the coalition has the upper hand when it comes to the decision making. And this is why we have this proxy war between Saudi Arabia, Iran, and also we have the United Arab Emirates. And they have their control, and they can influence the internal warring parties if they want in a way, either to end the war or to go to negotiations.
So in some sense, David, you can add to this more in a minute, but this also leads into another question we've had, which is, it's disappeared. What is what is Saudi Arabia trying to get out of all of this?
Is that referring to Yemen or its reform strategy?
It was a very short question.
I can take a stab at that one. I think the Crown Prince, when he started this, because he was the Minister of Defense when the war started, he wasn't the Crown Prince at the time. I think, again, this is just me trying to read the tea leaves of what, I mean, because what they say in public is very different than what I think the intent is of this war, which is to, he was new and he needed to prove his ability to run a war successfully. And he was hoping, I think genuinely hoping, that it was going to be an easy, quick win for him. What ended up happening is that it became his Vietnam. And that if he had actually studied the Americans well, I think he stopped at the Iraqi quick win rhetoric and didn't pay attention to what really was happening there. And I think he wanted to do something quite similar in Yemen and hoping that he would win. And I would add to what David was saying, that the racism is not only from the white gaze on Saudi Arabia and how that is looked upon and from the top down, but I would say that the Saudis in the Gulf, especially the Saudis and the Emiratis, had the same outlook toward the Yemenis. They really truly believed that they, with their money, that they could pay. And I mean, it's a terrible thing, but I've heard this when they were saying the Saudis and the Emiratis are willing to fight to the last Yemeni. Right, and so it's more about their political wins and less about the return of the republic or return of the president Hadi to Yemen and the ouster of the Houthis. They are now in talks with the Houthis, and so you really, what is the end game for the Saudis? I don't think they have one. I think it was a very bad miscalculation on his end, and he thought it would be a political win for him, and it isn't. And sadly, thousands of Yemenis had to pay the price for that stupid decision.
I think there's an element of this question of credibility as well, which you get in any military quagmire, where a state decides that it needs to go into whatever theatre, whether it's the US in Vietnam or in Iraq or the Saudis here. They think they can achieve their objectives, and then when they fail, they realise this makes them look really bad. Because part of being a military power is, it's not so much about always using your military power, it's your military power being credible. People don't screw with you because you've got that power. But the minute it fails, the minute it makes you look impotent, then that power kind of falls away. And so when you get into a military conflict and you get bogged down in it and you're not achieving your objectives, that's a real problem. And so you find states in those situations will keep throwing, in military terms, good money after bad. Sort of sunk cost fallacy. We're this far in, we just have to keep going and get something out of it.
I read some. I mean, because the Houthis keep droning the Saudis, and so I mean, it's the least amount of money that the Houthis could throw at something and damage them horrendously, because the attacks on the drone attacks all over Saudi Arabia show the ability of the Houthis to continuously threaten, not to any real extent, and nothing to compare to what the Saudis are able to do in Yemen, but still that goes to the really damaging look for the Saudis, that they're still unable to protect their own borders, which is allegedly what they were doing when they started this war as well, is to protect the Saudi borders from the Iranian-backed Houthi militias. But to go to one of the questions that has about the relationship between the Iranians and the Houthis, I would agree that it was exaggerated, especially in the beginning. And so it was, I would argue, it forced the Houthis closer to the Iranians than at the beginning of the war. And so whatever the nature of that relationship and the extent of it, before the war started, the Saudis for sure have extended and deepened that cooperation between the Iranians and the Houthis. And I would argue that this is the cheapest Iranian intervention in the region, the absolute cheapest they've done. And they've got the maximum impact from this relationship. So unfortunately, if they were truly saying that this is a proxy war between the Saudis and the Iranians, they've lost that one, because they've only managed to increase the influence of the Iranians. I don't know about the level of influence, but the depth of the relationship, I would say, between Ansar Allah and Iran. Would you agree?
That's a big part. That's a big part of that credibility question, because it's one thing, to fail in your military objectives. It's another thing to fail in your military objectives against your absolute bête noire, who you've set yourself up against, and to do so in such. It's not even a full frontal war against the Iranian state. It's a fight against a militia that the Iranians, as you say, have barely given them any help at all. So the Iranians must be laughing their heads off. Something I read recently from a British foreign correspondent, which I assume is something he's got from his contacts in the British state, is that the Saudis want to end the war, but they want to end it having achieved their military objectives. Well, I mean, everyone wants to, any party in any conflict wants to end the war once it's achieved its military objective.
But what is the military objective? I mean, it's a valid question as well, because it's a moving target. They keep changing what that military objective is, right?
Well,
the Houthis were persona non grata in the beginning, and now they're in Sweden, agreeing with them and having prisoner exchanges with them. So, I mean.
Well, that in that story, the person said it was about not leaving the Houthis in any kind of power. So, I mean, they're not going to evaporate, are they? And you've spent 5 years failing.
Are the Houthis still in power in Sana'a?
I mean, they're still present, in the same way as the Americans spent 20 years trying to get rid of the Taliban, and the Taliban are still there. So somehow in Iraq, the Americans said at one point, or some American official said at one point, we just need to declare victory and leave. And sooner or later, between the Saudis and their Western backers, they're going to have to come up with some sort of formulation where they can say, oh, we've achieved what we want to, and then they can get out. But God knows how they're going to do
that. Regarding the Houthis in Sana'a, they are like in power where they are holding the governmental institutions. But in general, any armed conflict, it's the best environment for armed groups to grow and to have influence. This is what we clearly see in the context of Yemen, and regarding the military objectives or the success. One of the tiny example I can mention is the closure of Sana'a International Airport. When it was closed in front of the commercial flights, the reason was that because there are Iranians, experts and designs of weapons, etc., are getting to the Houthis, and the Houthi leaders are moving in and out through Sana'a International Airport. But when we have the Sana'a International Airport closed and we see the attacks of Houthis are ongoing, this put the question about the closure of Sana'a International Airport highlighted. What's the reason? And the UN group of eminent experts in the report in 2018 or 19, they mentioned that these measures taken by the coalition to close the Sana'a International Airport may amount to a collective punishment for civilians who need to travel for long hours to the south and pass through countless security checkpoints controlled by Houthis and other authorities and armed groups to go to one of the airports in the south and take the flight from there to out of the country. And unfortunately, we have like hundreds, if not more than hundreds of cases where there are civilians who are in need of medical medical treatment abroad, and unfortunately they passed away because they couldn't travel or leave the country, or they passed away while they are in the road trip to the south, as happened to one of my relatives, unfortunately.
Thank you. And I guess some of this also relates to what you're saying about the need for redress and accountability earlier, and this could be one of the most important things that the UK government's calling for. I'm also going to pull out a couple of things from that our panelists have been answering questions live as well, but just in case some people haven't seen them, there's again a question of what do you think Saudi Arabia would do if the UK stopped supplying them with an air force, which relates to other questions about what it's going to take to bring the war to an end, following on from what you said before.
I mean, what can Saudi Arabia do? I mean, the question belies power on the Saudi end, that they can retaliate somehow. I mean, wasn't it Cameron who said on the BBC that we cannot cut relations with Saudi Arabia because they provide us with invaluable intelligence on counterterrorism? And so I think the issue is more the UK government, and would they dare do something like that? And it's not that the Saudis can stop them or anything. I mean, reality is, as David said, the UK and US do have the upper hand in this because they need them as cover, as legitimacy internationally, not domestically, because the Saudi government and the royal family don't actually care about the people. They've stopped caring about us a long time ago, and we are irrelevant to any conversation about how we are ruled. And going back to the fallacy, the mirage of the so-called reforms, because what they want to do is basically, if you followed what's happening in the building of this new fangled city called Neom, what is actually happening is the Saudi people who actually live there are being displaced by the hundreds. I know of at least 20 men and minors who are now in jail for protesting their displacement, for refusing to leave their homes. And so the reality is that the UK can do this. Whether they ever had the interest of human rights in Saudi Arabia, I doubt it, because one MP I heard was saying that we should be grateful to Saudi Arabia for doing this war on our behalf in Yemen. It's outrageous. This was 2018. Like, what planet do people live on that they still dare to say such things? And so it's a question I think for David to answer is, like, would the UK ever do something like that? And what's stopping them from doing it, actually? Because from a Saudi perspective, I don't see that they have the power to stop that from happening.
So just before you answer, just before you join in, David, there's also the question of Saudi government. Is the Saudi government effectively blackmailing the UK government by threatening to withdraw investment and stop intelligence cooperation?
Yeah, I guess, but to what extent, right? Like, the reality of, is that really a threat or not? Can they actually do that? They have a lot more to lose than the British government does.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it may all become moot anyway, because Biden has said he's going to withdraw support for the war. We'll see if he does it or not. I mean, there seems in the US to be almost a bipartisan consensus that the war has to come to an end. And the only people who don't buy into that bipartisan consensus are, unfortunately, the people in the White House who have vetoed congressional moves to end American support for the war. So once Trump is, I don't know if he sneaks out the back door, if he's dragged out kicking and screaming by security services in January 20th, but once he's left and Biden comes in, it seems to me that consensus that's been forming in Washington that the war's gone too far and it needs to be brought to an end, that will probably be enacted by Biden. And that has really come out of it's a mixture of political pressure from the left in America, channeled through Bernie Sanders and others in the Senate. And it's also the fact that I think in the US especially, there seems to be a sense in Washington that this guy MBS, he's not a reliable manager of that part of the world on behalf of the American empire. You know, they would have preferred someone else, frankly, someone with a bit more judgment, a bit more maturity, someone who didn't get involved in these costly military adventures, someone who doesn't go around chopping up journalists he doesn't like, someone who makes the relationship less politically costly for them. And so it wouldn't surprise me if not only do you have Biden coming in and withdrawing support for the war in Yemen, perhaps in some kind of phased way in next to negotiations, but also some kind of pressure on the Saudis, which I don't know if it will go so far as to say you need to get rid of this idiot and put someone serious in charge, or it will be directly to MBS, you need to calm down, we're not going to be your enablers anymore. So the question may not arise for the British, but I do nevertheless want to sort of underline what Safa was saying. I mean, they make these threats constantly, the Saudis, and I think partly what they're doing is giving their allies in London an alibi. The Saudis make a big performance. We're going to withdraw intelligence support. We're going to stop investing. You know, we're going to sell Man City, all this kind of thing. And then the British government will say, oh, well, you heard what they said. We're going to have to carry on supporting them. And it's not us doing this terrible thing. They're making us, the mean Arabs are making us do this. And the threat doesn't have any weight. I mean, it has some, but not as much as you'd think. For example, this thing about withdrawing intelligence. I mean, intelligence sharing is a two-way street. This is cooperation that goes on. And actually, Britain's capacity for picking up and sharing intelligence is far greater than the Saudis. Their capacity, not only in terms of MI6 and MI5, but also their links with the other, sort of allied powers. So probably the Saudis get as much from the intelligence relationship as the British do. Certainly the Saudis get far more out of the arms sales and military cooperation relationship than the British do. So this is blackmail to a large extent. And there's one little anecdote in terms of this. When, I don't know if people have heard this story, the Saudis get pissed off with the Lebanese prime minister because he's making nice with Hezbollah, which he has to because Hezbollah exists, but nevertheless, I don't like it. So when the Lebanese prime minister comes over to Saudi for consultation, they take his phone off him, rough him up, put him in front of a camera and tell him to resign. Ridiculous, absurd, and quite a thuggish kind of power move. At this point, President Macron of France gets involved. And Macron says, look, you need to release this guy and send him back. What on earth are you playing at? And MBS apparently said to Macron, back off, or I'm going to remove Saudi investment in France and I'm going to stop buying your weapons. And what Macron apparently said back to him is, look, we're France and we'll deal with whoever we like as we see fit. And MBS backed right down very quickly. So when Western politicians don't collude in that game, it's the Saudis who are forced to back down. And I think there are a number of examples in the British relationship where the Saudis have made these big threats. And the British government, this was true under Blair as well, by the way, the British government has used that as an opportunity to tell the public, we're going to have to live with this relationship because they're going to withdraw cooperation and it's going to be terrorist attacks on the streets of London. So it's a kind of blackmail, but it's a blackmail that the British government colludes in, along with the Saudis, to blackmail the British public, if that makes sense.
But can I add, just to complicate the whole intelligence issue, when it comes to Yemen, for example, the Americans have been involved in so-called counterterrorism in Yemen even before September 11, right? And so what's happened since the war is that the Americans, who don't have any boots on the ground anymore after the war happened because they evacuated most of their people, they were using Saudi and Emirati intelligence, so-called intelligence, to help them in finding targets of Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Yemen, right? And so what's happening now is that the Americans have quite willingly, and again, for what David was mentioning about stopping the war, nothing in the language in Congress to stopping the war includes the anti-terrorism actions that the US is directly taking inside Yemen, right? And so, for example, my latest film, I think if the links have been shown, is the American counterterrorism war in Yemen, and how vastly unbelievable the numbers are since Trump had taken office of killing civilians, right? And so what they've allowed the Saudis and the Emiratis to do is define terrorists on the ground, so-called terrorists, right? And the Emiratis have a different definition than the Saudis, than the Americans, of who is a terrorist, right? And none of those three have actually bothered to prove any of those things. So they have, for example, something called signature strikes. And so if you behave like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, then you can be a target of a strike. And so this is the most ridiculous thing. One of the things I covered is a drone strike on a car that had an entire family in it, a father and uncles. They were going to save their son from Al-Qaeda. Right, and so they targeted the car because, again, signature strike, the movement of the car in the area. And so now it's not like Al-Qaeda asks permission when they move into a neighborhood or in an area. And so the Americans have basically legitimized all Yemenis. Right, everybody can be a target now. Anything that's moving. I, as a journalist who's going to cover an area of one of those American raids, for example, I could be a target as well, because they can claim that I'm moving in the same area, behaving the same way as a terrorist. It's the most ridiculous thing. And so I would argue that the Americans, I wonder what the extent of the Obama administration's seriousness about stopping the human rights violations in Yemen, because I would argue that the Americans have been way more involved and way longer than anyone else. Of course, the Saudis have also been financially involved in internal politics in Yemen, and the Emiratis in a later stage. But I would question really the seriousness of the Biden White House from any true change in accountability, because it was under the Obama administration that this war started to begin with, right? And so I heard a lot of mea culpas from the Obama administration about how, oh, it was a mistake. Okay, now Obama administration part 2 is coming into office. Let's see how serious they are about actually taking their rhetoric to task and pay back for what they've done to the Yemeni people, acknowledge their mistakes, stop calling Yemenis terrorists, especially those families. For example, Yakla, I'm sure everybody heard of the first raid under the Trump administration. Over 30 people were killed, most of them civilians, and as men, women, and children. And not a word of apology from the American government. I think it's about time, if they're serious, that they apologize for these things, and they pay reparations, and they lift those labels, and they stop doing them. They just stop the war in Yemen. I mean, it's stop claiming that you're doing a favor to the Yemenis by stopping the war that the Saudi and Emiratis are waging right now. But they want to pretend that they are not directly involved in the killing of Yemenis.